Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me well enough this way?
Yep.
Okay. So, in preparation for this talk, I decided to select the things that are most tractable. Given that this is a very short talk, I know that I won't be able to go into all of the detail necessary to communicate anything, really. With that in mind, I sent along 3 papers in advance, which I hope you have access to on a server or printed out. If not, I'm assuming Lars and James can make them available. Is that possible?
These are all on the website.
Okay. So it's an interesting process for me because the papers actually came out over about 13 years. The original paper was in the book that Lars referred to, and in that chapter, the first chapter in the book, what I did was fit a 3-level model to data from a study in India. And I'll talk a tiny bit about that. And then I left it alone. I handled all of the statistical specification and gave a nice example in that chapter. And then I went on and did other things for 6 or 8 years. And over time, I realized that there was more to the work in that chapter than just the modeling. And that is that there was a fundamental change in the way we think about timescale. And that needed to be articulated better for the field. So in the next paper that you'll have access to, there is something called time-dependent longitudinal designs, or what I used as an acronym TDLD. And in that paper, I take up a lot of the details around how to select measures for different timescales and how to consider the formulation of a design given the presence of phenomena that exist at multiple timescales simultaneously. That chapter also includes an example on pain measurements that were taken over time at different timescales. And finally, just this last year, with a graduate student who took an interest, we developed 2 additional examples, and those are they're under review right now, but the paper's essentially accepted, and we think we'll be going forward within several days. And that that paper has 2 examples. The most interesting one, I think, is of soccer matches. What you call football, so what we call soccer. So what's interesting there is it's actually not the players, it's the referees. And the multiple timescales comes up due to halves of a football match or whole football matches and stints of time that are run, these types of things. So it's an interesting example. It's a little bit different for me because I typically don't work in sports science, but I think with those 3 examples, all of which include full code examples and tables and plots and so forth, anyone who'd like to fit any of the models that I'm going to refer to in passing today could go ahead and do so. So I'll really be leaving most of the statistical detail out and focusing on why you would want to get into a situation using a multi-level model to hit multiple timescales in the first place. So let's move ahead with the talk. A few people to recognize. A lot of my work over the last decade has been funded by the American Cancer Society. That's because a lot of the timescale data that I've collected is on smoking. And the papers that I've just mentioned are co-authored with these folks, Barda and others, and Daniel Smith. So the critical idea that I'd like to get across today is the fact that phenomena exist at varying timescales needs more emphasis as a central design consideration with analytical consequences and opportunities. I'm just reading that because it's a little bit laborious to say that, and it's a little bit hard, I think, at first to wrap your minds around what it actually means to have different timescales in a studied situation. So one way to begin to think about it is that typically when we design a longitudinal study or when we inherit data from longitudinal studies, when we tackle the data, usually you're looking for that column of numbers, sequential numbers that describes the time points at which the measurements were taken. And usually it's serially indicated 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or sometimes they're not evenly spaced. And we tend to refer to that variable as the counter variable or maybe an index. The statistical name for it is corresponds to the idea of metameter, that there's some beat, so to speak, going on in relation to the data that we're collecting. And we tend to just accept that the time scale is whatever we inherit or whatever makes most sense for the primary measurements that we're interested in. And when we do that, what tends to happen is we maybe overlook the fact that some of the things we're measuring do not exist at that most important time scale. Maybe another measurement exists at a completely different time scale. The basic idea of a time scale, an easy way to think of it is, say, clock time versus calendar time. That's the simplest clean and dirty distinction, your watch versus your calendar. And but it really becomes much more granular than that, as I'll show in the foregoing. One of the benefits of many measurements, of course, over time, is that you might inherit more power. You might have more measurements per allotment of time. But this is it's a peculiar thing. In the traditional ANOVA standpoint, when we think of power, if you have more within subjects measurements, we tend to attribute greater power and greater efficiency in the design overall. But this becomes a little bit elusive when you have multiple timescales, because the power may not cascade upwardly to some aggregation. It might be the case that you have multiple measurements that are simply measured at a time scale that is convenient, but not necessarily at the level of aggregation in which you want to make the inference. So it's tricky to think through power versus number of measurements in relation to time scale. And I'm a little bit leery of this idea of, oh, we have more measurements, therefore we have more power. I think that's a little bit of a dated idea, and the more important topic to take up is, do we have measurements at the right time scale? And if so, then what is our power? I think that intermediate question needs to be inserted before we go about making statements about power. So that's just something for you to consider as you consider power calculations for studies like this. The idea of aggregation is the final bullet on this slide, and this is a very contemporary issue that Peter Molinar has written about this recently, and one of his former students, Ellen Hamaker, maybe Ellen's on the Dutch exposure of this talk, I'm not sure, but this idea is that aggregation is not necessarily the right thing to do when you have multiple measurements. This idea of somehow we're going to take multiple measurements from a low time scale, such as your clock data, and summarize them over days using some average or some other fancy intercept or slope, whatever it might be. It may not be the case that upward aggregation is necessarily the right way to make inferences. So that's another issue to think about in tackling databases like this. Is it possible that when we analyze data, we need to respect the time scale at which data is collected at and make our inferences there? So these are very broad points, and I realize that, but there's limited time, so I wanted to make sure that I put them out there. These are the greatest themes, and I'll move ahead, and I think I'll touch back on them in multiple points. Just a little bit of review for those of you who've done this before. When we do have a metameter that's established, an index, one of the key things to consider is whether they're evenly spaced within that time scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or maybe 1, 4, 6, or what have you. And is it possible that irregular spacing is due to measurement versus the phenomena? When we have irregular spacing, is it because we can't afford to have regular spacing, for example? Or is the spacing of measurements really due to the way the phenomena is manifested? So distinguishing whether spacing of measurements is a measurement artifact, or is it due to the actual phenomena, is an important step when you're evaluating timescale. I think it's also important to think about processes that we're measuring as being stationary or not. This is really a time series conception. When processes are stationary, they're essentially interchangeable. You could take a segment of time from a later part in the time series and theoretically substitute it for an earlier part in the time series. But I'm taking the point more generally here, because I think that it's important that we think about time series that we're collecting that are inherently cyclical, because those time series have the possibility for dynamic modeling, be it time series modeling or some other modeling that's sensitive to to the regularity of cycles and patterns over time. And when you have multiple timescales, it's important that you capture the order of process for the different timescales that are being collected. For example, you might have your breathing rate, your respiration rate, being tracked at seconds. And the order of that process might be second to second, whereas your heartbeat might be at minutes. It might be at a different number of seconds or number of minutes that you're considering important for what you're studying. So characterizing a process that's cyclical, something that has an inherent regular beat to it, at the right order of process can be very important when you go ahead to model the data in whatever way you might. An interesting twist on this is a lot of our measurement protocols for these types of phenomena, health phenomena in particular, have blackout periods. For example, when you sleep, of course, it's difficult to track some of the cognitive behaviors, cognitive statements, feelings, these types of things. By the same token, when you are processing things during the day, it might be difficult to take continuous physiological measurements depending on your activities, going to a wedding, these types of things. So although we hope that we'll collect data on continuous processes over time, the reality of life is that we might need to sample over time certain types of processes. And that leads to more elaborate study designs. Non-stationary processes are also important to take in mind, and these come up a lot in the types of data that I collect. For example, you might have a study that is, for example, in smoking, where some set of events could drive the behavior. You may not be smoking at all, but suddenly you're exposed to a smoking environment, such as a bar or another environment where smoking is prevalent. And for that period of time, you need robust measurement of smoking because it's happening very frequently, and its impact can be greater. Same thing with drinking. Lots of health behaviors have this type of a pattern. So on the one hand, this represents an opportunity for efficiency. You don't need to be monitoring the cigarette smoking continuously when it might be low, but you need to monitor it intensively when it occurs. So this is yet another kind of a blackout period in that the regular time when the smoking is not happening regularly becomes blacked out, and what's of interest is a focal period for the behavior. So these event-driven processes, or event-driven by timescale processes, are of interest to me because they represent both the opportunity for more efficient measurement when it counts and less resource waste when it doesn't count. The trade-off there, though, is you're not necessarily getting the full process over time. You might need to be more selective about what you track when. So time-dependent longitudinal designs. The original designs came out of several literatures, but I'd like you to look at the third bullet here. This is borrowing from Campbell and Stanley's work, where they characterize many research designs using this type of notation. So the 0, there is actually an O here for observation. So what you have is observation 1, observation 2, observation 3, and then you might have some type of a delay. And then another burst of measurement. These are, in the literature, frequently referred to as measurement burst designs or burst designs. You would then measure again intensively, and then you'd have delay again, and you'd measure intensively again. The point of doing this is you believe that the important action is happening at a low time scale, say at days. So days 1 through 3 are collected, and then you think that the evolution of time between that intensive measurement and a later set of measurements is important longitudinally at a higher time scale, over months, for example. So 1 through 3 in the first block could happen at December 1st, and then 1 through 3 in the second block could happen on April 1st. And these types of designs come up frequently, especially when there are things like academic semesters involved, key junctures in life before and after the transition to adolescence, switches between grades, these types of things. You think there's some daily process that's important, but you believe it's the evolution of that process over, say, calendar time that's of greatest interest. So that's the basic motivation for thinking about time-dependent longitudinal designs, but it's the evolution of those designs that interests me the most. So let's say that you have that type of a basic measurement burst design in mind, and now you're going to create two groups. So that's one simple innovation that you could undertake. You're going to track what happens to one group that you've treated over time in terms of their within-person, local, low timescale process and how that process evolves over time. That's one option. Or you could become much more involved in the way you notate this. This is actually something I experimented with for this talk. You might want to articulate fully exactly how many measurements you're taking at each point within a burst. So here is a set of measurements. At time 1, you're going to create 5 measurements, and then you're going to have an intervention within a burst. And then you have 5 more measurements at time 2, 5 more measurements at time 3. So you inherently have 2 time scales within a burst here, and then a delay, and the same thing would occur. And because I couldn't fit this all on a bullet, I had to innovate with my notation. So now I have observation 1, day 1, and observations to the 5th at a lower time scale, say minutes or hours. And then repeating that over time shows you a 2 time scale with intervention within burst design that you would then carry forward over time into later bursts. So you can easily see with this notation how you have 3 timescales represented. Now, why would I become a little obsessive about this? The reason is that I've seen researchers and I've worked with researchers who want to collect data at these multiple timescales. They inherently know that they need to collect data at these timescales, but formulating it is a little confusing. Typically, you're handed some device that is relevant to what you study. Maybe it's a Fitbit, maybe it's a cell phone, maybe it's even a GPS tracker, and you tend to just let it go. Okay, let it track, without formulating the design fully. So I think this is an important exercise in framing a design, and it's this framing that would then allow you to formulate power analyses properly, and to anticipate your analytical strategy at the end. So I'm really making a point, despite the apparent obsessiveness about notation, about the importance of framing this design, whatever design you might have, involving multiple timescales with notation as an exercise in advance. And here's an elaborate example, one that Lars has seen before. So this is from my colleague Saul Schiffman, who works in smoking research, and this is his attempt to formulate the design that he uses most frequently graphically. So this has both continuous or stationary type measurements and event-driven type measurements within it. And it's another way of formulating the design in advance that I think is equally viable. It's more graphical. So here's a day with all the hours, 1 through 12. And here are the cigarette smoking events that are reported by people as they occur, the little C's. And then there are times when they're tracking cigarette reports automatically through a cell phone device, and then they're asking for an end-of-day report, and then the same thing kicks off for day 2, and it goes on for 40 days. So you can see, here's a real example of a very elaborate design, and in this case, they actually had 2 groups. So it's like the first design that I showed you. You'd have randomization occurring over here. 200 or so subjects are following this without intervention, and the other 200 are following it with pharmacological and behavioral treatments going on beginning at day 18. So if you've not worked with these types of studies before, here's a nice example of what they actually look like when you lay one out. It's important to briefly touch on some background for all of this, not only out of respect, but because I think many of you might want to follow up and look at some of these materials. A lot of my thinking on this is driven by wanting to well characterize the individual. So ideographic conceptions are very important, and I've provided a few references that I like in this realm. It's important to realize, I think, that increasingly a lot of these studies are driven by measurement through technology, and I'll make a few comments at the end of my talk about recent trends in technology-based measurement here in the States. Way back, these go to diary studies, beeper studies, and so on. And in the US, the most current catchword for all of this in the health arena is so-called mHealth. I'm not sure if that's popular jargon in the UK or elsewhere in Europe, but a lot of this these days with NIH funding is falling under the realm of mHealth, these types of studies. A little more background here. I'm not going to take the time to go through it. And this is the specific background on the measurement burst design, which I've elaborated with notation. I don't need to go through all the detail, but I again wanted you to have the references for it. So here's a nice graphical representation of a multiple burst design with intervention. This is an interruption type intervention. So you might have one group. Here's a burst, another burst, and a burst. You can see there's small delays in between, and then an interruption of some kind and follow-up bursts later on. And this could be for one or more groups. So some of you might like to think of this graphically. This is what your data would look like typically when it comes in for this type of design. And conceptually, to give you a couple examples, why would you think about having measurement occurring at two timescales? Well, you might have theory, for example, that operates at two levels. For the realm of school learning, you might have some very micro-level type of learning where you're getting feedback on some type of a learning process, and you'd expect that iteratively over time, those learning cycles would help you to progress. Whereas at the molar level, over time, something global like your motivational tendencies and your overall outcomes year over year might be changing. So these are rather disconnected, these classroom-level learning types of things versus these overall evolutions of motivational and educational attainment outcomes evolving at the calendar time. And I'm taking the opportunity here to cameo a paper that I collaborated with Lars on, which is not directly related to this content, but which is in the same spirit. Where Lars collected data at the micro level and through rather sophisticated analyses worked to analyze how they relate to the molar level. More detail on that. Once you've formulated a theory, you might then have a timescale for it. And in this case, because of developmental tendencies, the timescale may not be even. There might be critical milestones occurring at uneven time points in maturational time. So in this case, you'd be looking for a measurement burst to occur at critical periods around key developmental moments, key developmental milestones in maturational time. Sorry, I duplicated that by accident. Then another study that I'd like to cameo here is one by Hoffman and Hofer. So this is another case which is a little more regular, where you have people who are seniors, and you're studying them into their later years, and you're looking at their cognitive decline. So if you imagine the slide that I gave a few slides ago, rather than increases in ability, you're looking at decrement in ability over time. And what they're using is an experimental intervention. And they're seeing how people perform over calendar time, but the tasks are bursts of tasks that they do within days. So they actually have learning occurring within days, and they're looking at the learning that occurs within days as it occurs over calendar time. So the cases in which these types of designs can be deployed are very diverse. It can be in health behavior, learning and motivation, cognitive decline, and so on and so forth. And here's how they represented their design. They showed burst 1 with 6 sessions over 6 to 10 days, and they're looking for that short-term change in learning and memory and so forth. And then they're looking for how the overall performance within those bursts changes over 6-month intervals.
If we can go another 10 minutes, that would be great.
Okay. So I like this slide a lot. This is from a chapter by Newell, who used to be at Carnegie Mellon. And what it provides is a nice structure for organizing timescales. It implies that there actually might be some inherent organization to timescales. So if you're selecting a process of some kind, be it a health behavioral process or a cognitive process, it might be that in general, those types of processes fall within this band. They tend to be at the seconds level or milliseconds level. Whereas the kinds of things that I'm working the most on tend to be up here, so-called the rational band or the social band. So a cigarette smoking behavior we're tracking frequently in the minutes space, but we're looking also for the change in behavior over sometimes as much as months, but as frequently days and weeks. I think most psychological studies are here, whereas an interesting thing that's happening now is with all of the Fitbit type devices and other movement types of devices, we're tracking a lot of things here, and I'm not sure that we're actually that adept yet at connecting the information that we collect at this band with the information that's occurring at these bands. So if you, whatever content you might be working on, I think you could benefit from thinking through where your measurements exist depending on your outcome. I'm sure you all have multiple outcomes depending on what you're looking at. Is it possible that you have all of these represented? And if so, how are you going to tackle the task of considering that information together? And as if that's not bad enough, it could be also, even if we think we're measuring information at a certain time scale, especially when cognitions come into play, taking Newell's second band for a moment, it could be that our conception of time itself is variable, that we're constructing our experience of time around certain experiences differentially, one experience to another. So my cigarette experience might be encoded in terms of packs, in terms of what's relevant to me, packs per day or packs per week. Whereas what's measurable might be cigarettes or even puffs. Or it could be, for example, with mood, what's relevant is a mood disorder event leading to a suicide event, something like this, an attempt. Whereas what's being measured could be some neurological suggestion of a mood change. So how do we integrate these very disparate indicators of phenomena varying depending on what's important to the person and what's important to the researchers? And this brings in, of course, a further issue of reactivity. When you're being tracked intensively, especially if it's in the cognitive band, and you're aware of the fact that you're being tracked, it could be that you're reacting more to the measurement than to the phenomena, then you're not acting naturally. It could be this reactivity or reactance, as Stanley and Campbell put it, is infusing itself into the measurement protocol. It seems like self-report is particularly vulnerable to this, as it is even if you're collecting single measurements. But if you're giving multiple self-reports over time, you're always being asked to think about the same thing. It could be that you centrate on certain scores. My intuition with that is frequently to move to less self-report reliant measurements, but I've learned over time that you don't necessarily overcome reactivity, you change the kind of reactivity. It could be that the devices have their own reactivity to things like the error associated with wearing them over time, the vulnerability to knowing that you're being tracked over time. It could just be a little bit muted in terms of how devices are carrying the reactivity forward. So going back to my original points, just to reiterate a little bit, my main concern in this short talk is that you begin to think about design basics when formulating a time-dependent longitudinal design, and that when you tackle points like these, that you think about all of the foregoing. So how many time points do you need to capture the dynamics that you're interested in? We talked about stationary or non-stationary processes. We talked about multiple timescales. We talked about different locations along those timescales. efficiency then comes into play. You want the greatest result for the lowest investment. So how can you select among the timescales just those points that are most crucial to understand the dynamics so that you don't drive up reactivity? It's a very delicate balance, I think, to find just the minimal amount of measurement needed at just the right times among the timescales to get the best possible precision of measurement.
Is that coming a good point to
Yeah.
wrap up on, Ted?
Yes.
It would be great to hear all the slides, but we're aware of time. So could we ask for questions at this point? If we turn to question time now, Ted. So we have questions here in the room or also from our webinar followers. And to ask the questions, I will repeat them for Ted. I think I'll go ahead and ask a question of you, Ted. And this idea of reactivity is something we have discussed here today, that people, as they take part of an intensive longitudinal study, they actually start focusing on the things that the study is paying attention to, like self-monitoring and so on. And so do you have a point on this reactivity, as this is actually something that could be used for interventions?
I'm not sure I follow the question entirely, but one idea that comes to mind is that some people have suggested that it might be important to try to measure the scope of your reactivity as part of your protocol. That if you could build in a measurement that would give you insight into the degree of activity, the degree of reactivity impacting your study, then that might give you the ability to analytically later on handle some of that reactivity. So getting simple reports on, simply asking people, to what degree did you feel that you were responding due to being tracked all the time? Having some sense of the differential. People's individual differences might lead one person versus another to be more vulnerable to that feeling, the feeling of being tracked all the time.
Yeah.
If there are no questions right now, I can skip ahead a little bit and just focus on a couple more things. I can't really see if there are questions.
There is one more question, so Reinhard.
I mean, that would be a general question, and it also then relates to how it would be possible to build theory on a useful and justifiable scaling of time. I mean, you would not want to model smoking behaviors on a millisecond level, right? You would also maybe not want to model it in terms of assessing it every 20 years. So it's something in between. But how to use how to select a useful level? So that's a major challenge, right? I mean, could you conceive of any general guidelines on how to do that, or is that just specific to the research question that we are looking on?
I think you, yeah.
Okay, I
heard that, I think, yeah.
So I think it's really the latter is the best strategy. I think it is specific to the research question. And what I'm proposing is not really all that groundbreaking. It's simply that by virtue of my role in creating methods and working with researchers who are trying to deploy analytical methods of varying types, I frequently see the impact of, call it, defaulting to the standard measures, whatever the technology might carry, and simply taking that as the metameter that's available. So let's say that your device has a timestamp every 10 seconds. Well, you just accept that because that's the timestamp it has. It might be possible to reformulate the way that device works in advance if you're thoughtful in advance about what metameter you need for the phenomena you're interested in. For example, in smoking behavior, which you mentioned, Recently, I ran across a researcher who believes that very young people could be developing addiction within 3 to 6 exposures to cigarettes, meaning there's something going on at the cellular and neurochemical level through exposure to the nicotine molecule, and it actually is at the momentary milliseconds or lower level, that very low in the biological band level. So how do you formulate a design for people living in the real world that's collecting data at that level? It's probably quite difficult to do. But thinking through, what type of measurements would actually characterize these exposures for the level of a theory like that's quite different from what most people are pursuing in smoking research. It's an instantaneous level of exposure rather than a day-to-day or week-to-week level. So my point is only to increase advanced thinking about this and to provide frameworks for thinking about timescales so that when substantive scientists go after the formulation of new studies that involve multiple timescales, that they have some basis for reasoning through this a little bit more than has currently been available.
Okay.
And the papers that I've included, particularly the TDLD paper with Barda and others, really go into a lot of detail, really rehearse a lot of the thinking that is important for this type of design formulation well, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Ted. One more question, or there's a question here, Rebecca?
I'm not sure if it's a question or a comment really, but it's really interesting, I think, what you're arguing for, because I think there's a tendency with all the excitement around the data that we can collect, that we just accept it rather than shape it. And do you think there's a kind of disconnect between those who are able to collect this data and those of us who can analyse it or use it, that we're not really working together enough to really shape what goes on later?
Were you able to hear the...
I was.
Yeah, great.
From what I can tell, she's nicely stated what I've been trying to state all along.
Yeah.
So let me take advantage of that, though, and just with the few moments I have left, point to a little bit of the analytical work in these papers, if that's all right, Lars?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so here's a classic case of utilizing the timescale that was kind of typically available. This is early in the days of ESM or experience sampling method types of studies. So these were some researchers in India whom I agreed to work with. And they were collecting data on the idea of freedom in your school studies, like whether you could feel like you were able to have discretion about what you did in the context of school. And there was some suggestion of theory that the more free that you felt to make choices about your school activities, the more control you would be able to exert over things. So this kind of reflexive idea, that was the theory. So we modeled the relationship between so-called control and choice, and we found that there was a meaningful correlation at the bivariate level within subject. So that's the first level you have of timescale. There's a momentary, simultaneous relation between two variables within timescale. But then what we did was we took the aggregate correlations for each person over days. So we found that relationship was very high on a Monday, but as the week went on, it kind of fell apart. And then it did this strange thing on Sunday. So Sunday was a day where a large subpopulation of the students were allowed to take school off, but another population were forced to stay in school even on Sunday. So what you have is this feeling of low relationship between control and choice by the end of the week. Things are feeling kind of distorted, whereas this feeling of having to maintain control being maybe hampered by having to stay in school on a Sunday for these kids. These are in India, so having this relationship sort of deteriorated over the week. So this is the second level of analysis, disregarding the theory. What you have here is the possibility that something is happening at the day level, but it's the product of what's happening at the momentary level, the association of two variables at the momentary level. And then a third level of analysis would be to predict for something about this pattern using some covariate. So a three-level model would take momentary associations, aggregate them in some way by day, and then predict for those day-to-day relationships. So that's just to make it graphical a little bit. This is an example of what you would do. You use some other variable like sex to predict for that day-to-day change that you saw in the graph. And this is just a quick cameo. This is the same idea applied to pain data. So you have 6 days of pain at multiple bursts over time. And you can see that this pattern is kind of characteristic over time. In the paper that you have, the paper with Barta and others models these data. These are data from Stosky, who's a co-author in the paper. So I think what you'll find in the papers is the opportunity to, if you have this type of an application and you'd like to use ready technology, the multi-level model is widely available. I think this three-level conception applies well to many of the cases that are occurring when people are collecting these types of data. It has limitations, of course. The concerns about aggregation apply to the multi-level model as they would to any other type of model that aggregates data over time scales. So it's vulnerable to criticisms that what's really going on is you're aggregating over time scales, and it isn't a solution, which is to my final point that a lot of my focus analytically for the last several years has been on how to create more robust descriptions of within-person data and in advance of aggregating or not aggregating, simply characterizing within-person patterns robustly has been a major focus for me. Some of that has involved clustering, which is kind of is sidestepping a little bit the idea of aggregation, but that's an important area of work for me. And final thing I'd like to mention is this movement called the quantified self. Do you have this in Europe, I wonder?
Yeah, one in London, which is up and running and doing well, we think.
Okay. Yeah, I went to their conference a couple weeks ago out in San Diego and spent some time with Gary Wolf, who's the editor of Wired, who wrote about this in the mid-2000s. And I really like what's happening there. They had a group of people who were creating their own devices for monitoring their insulin pumps and giving themselves, so they call it an artificial pancreas. And a father in particular who created this for his son, and they're collecting data. But one of the interesting conversations I had was they said that they're very interested in the AR2 parameter. And I said, okay, why? And they said, well, it's the one that seems to be most related to the outcomes that they're seeing. And I said, well, do you know what AR2 is? And the answer is not really. So what we're seeing, I think, is a movement of technology into the hands of users, and including they're taking a great interest in the analytical side of studying themselves. And they're inheriting not only the technology, but the attribute data. So how do they make sense of a parameter that requires maybe a semester of time series analysis to even begin to understand? What I see in this is, I don't mean this critically, what I see in this is an opportunity for kind of societal enrichment, for creating tools that are more generally accessible and can help people in all walks of life to analyze their own data. So I'm working on a paper right now for that arena. There's a new journal that they're founding called N of One Journal, and it has papers due in November, I think. I can send along a link to Lars if you'd like, if any of you are interested in submitting to that. But it's a really interesting new field that has the opportunity to, I think, bring researchers closer to practitioners and citizens who are engaging in citizen science, and kind of make all of our work more relevant that way. So.
Okay, thank you, Ted.